Well, welcome everyone. Today I want to talk about the ins and outs of tent design, using the tools of geometry and computer-aided design software to reach an end goal. First thing I want to say is that humans have been making shelters for as long as we've been a species. I think once we lost our fur and moved into colder climates especially, our very survival depended on them. And so here I just wanted to walk you back a little bit in history and show you a few early examples of shelters. First one is, might have been constructed of mammoth bones and mammoth hides. Strong, stable. If you're camped in one place for a while, it would make sense. Not very portable, but that's all you have. That's what you have. Here's one that's more recent, maybe from a couple hundred years ago. This is on the Mongolian steppe, we think, and these are sticks and caribou hides, and you can see sort of a familiar kind of A-frame sort of design. And then here's one bit more recent. This was out in, I think, in Oklahoma or someplace. And this is sticks or tree branches and buffalo hides. And then here's one. I don't know where this was taken exactly, but you can see this shelter is comprised entirely of wood products, of sticks or branches and tree bark. And then lastly, maybe in some alternate universe, we can shrink down and get into pretty much anything. And so here's what we could do with a coconut shell, where we're able to get a whole lot smaller. Okay, so let's talk about materials. So all tents are comprised of what I call skins and skeletons. And some of the skins and skeletons we just looked at from prior years. Modern skins and skeletons are quite different. Here's some examples of modern skins. These are coated materials, coated nylon, coated polyester, and some laminate materials. Dyneema being quite sort of famous these days. These are, the advantage of these materials, of course, is that they're significantly lighter, more packable, higher water resistance, stronger, all that stuff. Perfect for putting on your back and taking to the next campsite. So those are, modern skins are one thing. And now what do we do for the skeleton part? Well, as it turns out, most people, many hikers, I would say, have the skeletons right in their hands, and that being the trekking poles. So here's a couple photos of that. Trekking poles are light. They're made of carbon fiber or aluminum. They can be stored on your back if you want, or they're in your hands all day long. And when you get to camp, you just repurpose them. That's the idea. It allows for 2 fixed points in space from which you can hang your skin. It does limit what you can do with a tent ultimately, because if you want a more curved sort of structure, you're going to need something that has a curvature to its skeleton, and that's not the nature of trekking poles. So here's a curved structure you can use. These are arch poles. The whole idea is that they're portable. You can fold them up, but they're also flexible, so you can bend them into arch shapes of various kinds, and you can add more arches to other arches and create all kinds of different geometries with them. So let's talk about what do we do with the skins and skeletons? Well, it all starts with what it is that we're trying to cover, and that being people. So that the people here are, they have height and width and length and depth, and all of that stuff needs to be covered by your shelter. So as you can see, we can spin these guys around. I've added a little box here, and that represents kind of the minimum usable volume what you want to protect. So when you want to sit up, you want to lie down anyway, and you want some space for your feet to stick up into the air, and for your head, especially if you're on a pillow, and your pads have real world depth to them. Height to them, I should say, and so that gets you up off the ground. And so all this volume you need to protect. And the last thing that you need to think about when you're doing designs is what happens when I want to sit up from or lie down from a sitting up position. So that's what this arch represents. It represents me pivoting up from my hips up to some vertical sort of orientation. And ideally, I don't want to hit the shelter on my way up and on my way down. So that's sort of what this represents. And ideally what I want my shelter is to completely cover this volume, protect this volume. So that's sort of my initial goal here with any shelter if possible. Okay, so where do we go next? Well, the answer is found in geometry. Geometry is the literal storehouse of designs for all tent structures. And our task really is to pick the appropriate geometry for our intended use, tweak it if necessary to make it fit our set of conditions. All of these can be constructed of skins and skeletons, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses and complexities and weights and utilities, and it's just about finding the one that ticks the most boxes for your intended use. Okay, let's take a look at these sort of a bit from the side so you get a better sense of them. The classic pyramid tent, that's a geometrical tetrahedron structure. This center pole can be a trekking pole, although if you look carefully at it, typically trekking poles aren't tall enough to get reasonable wall angles for real, to be able to use the entire interior. So you need a taller pole, which can be sometimes two poles grafted on top of one another, or a dedicated taller pole. But anyway, it's a very simple structure. It's strong and stable. It's 4 stakes and a pole, and you're sort of done. Another classical structure here is the triangular prism, or the A-frame. So this is the one where 2 trekking poles, one on either end. You can put people inside it along the axis, so that it's sort of a double entrance tent. You each get your own entrance, but you're going in one way, or you can rotate your occupants 90 degrees such that you each have your own entrance, private entrance in some sense, on one side of you. And double-side entrance tents, I think, are often preferable if for only for ease of use getting in and out for each of you. Okay, and then let's keep going around. These are now some arch pole structures. This is that classic dome tent, the half-cylinder tent. Two poles bent into an arc shape. I've left out all the guy lines that would need to hold this thing up, or the vestibules, but that's the basic idea. And then let's go all the way around actually to this end, because this is the next sort of most simplest arch pole structure. This is a single arch pole with an extruded surface off each end out to some point, sufficient to contain the occupant or occupants, but generally it's an occupant. It just works better for this design. And then the classic dome tent, which I will argue comes directly from an ellipsoid structure, sort of a stretched sphere. And these lines represent the intersection of vertical planes through the ellipsoid, and then where that intersects forms the arch structure. And you strip away all the fabric and sort of resurface it with a different set of surfaces to form your dome tent. But I think that's the genesis of a dome tent. And then lastly, the most complex one here on the page is the geodesic polyhedron, or the geodesic dome. And these have a very complicated pole structure, but they produce amazing interior volume, really maximize the interior volume and the strength of the structure. And so for extreme storms, you can't really do any better than this kind of a structure. But they're heavy and they're complex, and for people doing ultralight hiking, probably not the best choice. Okay, let's talk about complexity and simplicity. So the structure we just looked at, the dome structure, has a lot of moving parts, as it were, a lot of pole structure, but it does the job incredibly well. It's just that it's very complex. And so if our goal is simplicity generally, and if we're not worried about extreme winds, then we can simulate this volume or duplicate this volume in a much easier way. So what I wanted to show you was what happens if I were to sort of analyze this volume and think, how else could I erect a pole structure to create or simulate that kind of volume? And it turns out I can get there almost with just a single arch pole through the middle and a cross beam. And as you can see, this is pretty much the same volume, but with a dramatically simpler pole structure. And when I did the math, it's almost 9 times as much pole structure to get to there from there. So you can imagine what that does to the weight of the structure. Again, that's a much better structure for extreme conditions, but this one is a whole lot simpler and more packable. All right, well, all of these geometries have implicit or an inherent structural and aesthetic symmetry, as you can see. And so that's great. And it turns out that's really kind of optimal for wind performance, especially, but there are limitations. And it's important to understand what those limitations are. And you can tweak these structures to make them work better for your intended use. What I want to show you is this structure is the yellow structure here is the classic right pyramid, and the blue one is a shifted. You can see I've shifted the pole off to one side, and that makes it what's called an oblique pyramid. Now, why would I do that? Well, if you look at the first structure, when I'm sitting up, I'm very close to the pole, and it makes it kind of awkward to kind of move across to the other part of the shelter to maybe my partner's side or grab my gear or whatever. I have to maneuver around this pole. It's always kind of in my face when I'm sitting up and lying down, and it's a little awkward, I would say. So by shifting the pole off to one side, it makes pivoting across the structure a whole lot easier. The pole is basically now behind my head when I sit up, and it's just not in my way, and I have much more access to the interior volume space. So that's all good. As we're about to see, though, there are some ramifications to changing structures like this. But generally, if I want more interior volume on a pole, or interior usable space, really unobstructed by the pole, I got to move the pole. And as you can see, as I spin it around here, you can see kind of the difference. The classic right pyramid, the pole is very much kind of in my face, and if I shift it, it's behind my head. Okay, now let's talk about symmetry with respect to wind. So the wind in a classic right pyramid, what the wind sees from all directions of this structure is pretty much the same thing. It sees this triangular surface. It doesn't really matter whether the wind is this direction or this direction or this or this. To the wind, it appears to be the same structure all the way around. And so for you, the user, it doesn't really matter how you pitch it. Even in a swirling wind, it does pretty much the same thing. So that's all an upside. Now, if I were to move the pole to get more access to more of this interior volume space, that has a wind ramification. So here I'm gonna, well, first let me quickly digress here. These blue lines are tension lines. And so together, these tension lines, where I stake it to ground, form the way to resist the wind. So this tension vector and this tension vector combine to produce a tension vector going this way, which directly opposes the wind. And the same is true on all shelters, but and you can see as I spin it around, I get really, it feels the same to the wind all the way around. But if I change the structure, so I'm gonna move the pole, and I see that I have new tension lines here. These two sum to produce an outward force this way, which resists the inward wind force on this side and on this side, same thing. But it's a little different on this side now. These are two different tension vector lines. And so what happens is that because this one is sort of closer in angle to this wind force, this one takes the brunt. So there ends up being more stress on this seam than on this seam in the advent of wind. And that puts more stress on the seam and ultimately on this low stake. So in this configuration, this low stake is a little bit more likely to pull out if it's in bad soil or a loose stake, a short stake, whatever. And also the structure will just move and flex a bit more. And you'll get more stretch in this seam. This is a longer seam. This will stretch a bit more. It's an asymmetric kind of stretch, so this will stretch a little bit too, but not as much as this one will. And so ultimately, you'll just get more shifting and shaking of the structure in this configuration. And the last thing I want to do, and you can see as I spin around, clearly it's a different structure depending on the wind direction. Now, what if I want to open up my interior volume even more by shifting that pole now off that last point, but down closer to a corner to open up more interior space, but that actually changes the tensions even more. So now we have four distinctly different tension lines. And so no matter the wind direction on this structure, one of the corners is going to take the hit more than the others. So in any wind direction, you're more likely to pull a stake out in this configuration, and you'll get more just inherent stretching and flexing in the structure because none of these tensions are the same. The other thing to notice is that I've also increased the panel size. Now I've created larger panels than any of the prior iterations, and the larger the panel, the worse it does in the wind. Which, depending on the wind, on the conditions, may or may not matter. But it's just something to think about. All right, so we've sort of danced around CAD until now. Let's look distinctly at what CAD does for you, computer-aided design software. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a very simple creating a simple double half cone. So on my screen here, this is my arch. I've bent a pole into an arch structure. I'm going to center myself under it. I'm going to put myself into a box. I want to make sure that I shield this minimal box. so I can at least move around and not the structure is not going to hit my feet or my head. And then I'm going to extrude the curve down over the structure until I sufficiently cover it. So let me just do that, and you can see the power of the CAD visually as well as mathematically. So I'm going to drag that thing over my space, my volume, until it sufficiently covers it to my intended use. And it's just a very powerful tool, as you can see. And then I can spin it around, I can look at it, I can analyze it. You know, what's going to happen in the wind? Is this going to be sufficiently, does this do what I want it to do? And if it doesn't, I can tweak it. But immediately I kind of know whether it works or it doesn't. And that's not something that pure mathematics will give you. It just, the visual power of this tool is just tremendous. I couldn't do what I do without it. All right, and lastly, let's talk about building a real structure, having a goal, and then coming up with some sort of end product that fits all of those needs. So this is where we start. Again, it's the payload, it's the people inside. We want to cover them up. We want them to sit up and lie down and be able to move around and have space for gear and all that. So to get there, what we do is we model them. So they're on pads, they're on a floor. We're going to put a structure over them. In this case, what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with the classic A-frame, modified triangular prism structure, and then go from there. So you can see that my two trekking poles, you can see my classic kind of A-frame, simple sort of tarp-like structure. You know, been around for a long time. You can see that it does the job, but it's 4 stakes, and then 2 more lines really coming off the top of each trekking pole to stabilize the thing. I can put an end doors on it. I can cover this area, flat surface, or a sort of vestibule area out front. That's fine. But as I spin around, I look at it. I start to notice that it's got a lot of extra material that I don't need and can't use. So all of this area up here is really not usable by me. If I'm on my floor, on my pads, this is just useless to me. So, and not only that, it's not only is it extra weight, useless volume, but it's a wind load. So wind increases as you go above ground level, and so this area takes a lot more hit from the wind than down here. And whatever I can do to minimize surface area up high is ultimately best for handling winds. So I want to get rid of that. Well, how do I do that? Well, what you can do is you can just inset your poles, as so. Same poles, just moved inward, and look what happens to my structure now. I've now lost all of that fabric up high, which is great. The other thing that I've done is now I've minimized the footprint, because whereas I had to find a staking point out here, or perhaps out here to a tree or whatever, it still defines how I can pitch it, the area that I can pitch it in. By changing it to this structure, now I've lost all that extra need for exterior space. I only need my 4 corner points, and that's it. I've lost the material up here. It's now a lighter structure. It's stronger in the wind. That's all great. As I continue to spin it around, I realize, oh, of course, I can just put a flat door across it. It'll get the job done. I can put a zipper up the door. Good to go. Ready to ship as a product. Except that, as I keep spinning it around, I go, well, I'm still kind of close to those walls for my feet and my head. I'm not going to have a lot of ability to kind of slide around on my structure without hitting something. And the other big problem is that I can't go from lying down to sitting up, or sitting up to lying down without hitting my head on this thing. If I pivot around my hips, this purple structure shows what happens when I sit up or lie down. You can see I'm running into the wall, and there's just no way around in this configuration. So what you can do is you can dramatically increase the pole size, of course, probably to above the level of well above the level of a typical trekking pole, maybe up to about here, and then draw a line down here, and that would just graze the purple surface here. That would get the job done, but now I've added a lot more material up high and just extra fabric and volume I don't need. I can't use. I can't use this volume up here. It's more than I am sitting down. What's the point? So it's not a great solution. The other solution is to extend the structure horizontally, to be able to get to the point where I can sit up and lie down when I pivot. But again, that's just more fabric, and it dramatically increases the area that I need to set the tent up in. So that's not a great solution either. So it's really back to looking at the original geometry and seeing how can we change this original geometry with flat surfaces to more of a curved surface in some sense. And what we can do is we can replace that flat surface, two-dimensional surface by a three-dimensional surface. And we do that by adding an oblique pyramid over the top of that flat panel, and then removing, of course, the interior panel. So we've gone from that surface to that single surface to now 4 separate surfaces that becomes, it's a faceted surface. So the wind will flow over this much easier. Each of these panels is significantly smaller than the one that it replaced. So none of these panels are more than a third as big as they once were. And I've added 25% more volume to the structure that I didn't have before. So that dramatically increases my livability. I can use the full length of this tent all the way up to the end. And this last panel right here is vertical, which means I can open it up. So I'll get views and venting that I couldn't possibly have gotten out of the original structure. So that, to me, is a significantly improved version of the original design. Should be good to go, except that this shelter, like all structures, suffers from gravity load. So gravity pushes down on everything, and as pictured here, this is an impossible structure. In the real world, these lines will never stay straight because gravity pushes down on them, and you'll get sag in the structure. So fortunately, we have a tool for fixing that, and that's called the catenary curve. So by curving these lines, what I will introduce is a curved set of tension vectors, and some portion of all of those tension lines will be directly up, and that produces the force necessary to counteract gravity and keep the structure strong and stable under gravitational and wind loads. So by curving the structure now, all these seams curved makes it dramatically stronger, and it takes care of the sag that will always happen because of gravity. And so now I think I'm pretty happy with it, and this structure actually became what we now call the dipole. Okay, just some final thoughts here. It's all a trade-off. Just decide what matters. You as the tent designer get to pick what you want to suit your intended use. You're not going to solve all the problems, but you can solve individual ones or some set of individual ones, and that's good enough for intended use. The other thing to understand, it's when especially when you're first starting out, is that things will go wrong inevitably. I've beaten my head against the screen so many times over the years, and it's all a learning experience. It's okay to fail. That's how you learn. And that CAD, of course, is the key. I couldn't do what I do without it, and it's just an incredibly powerful tool. And when you want ideas for shelters, go to geometry. That's where they're all found, one way or the other. And then if you're making your own stuff, here's some sources for getting materials and pieces and parts, including it's just worth it even just to go to your local hardware store and walk the aisles, and your sewing store and walk the aisles, and it'll give you some ideas. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Feel free to ask questions. I'm always available at henry@tarptent.com.